June 15th, 1941. Tokyo, Japan. A Soviet intelligence radio operator transmits an encrypted message to Moscow. The text is short. War will begin on June 22nd. 3 directions of attack. 170 divisions. The information lands on Stalin's desk. Stalin picks up a pencil and writes in the margins, quote, "Tell this scoundrel to go to hell. This is not a source, but a disinformation agent." On June 22nd, Germany attacks the Soviet Union, exactly as stated in the encrypted message. Every direction, every division, every detail. The man who sent this message was named Richard Sorge. He was later exposed and hanged in a Tokyo prison. But before his death, he provided information that allowed the USSR to defeat Germany outside Moscow and turn the tide of the war. And now, if you were asked, why did the Soviet Union win World War II? One of the answers would be Richard Sorge, one of the craziest and most incredible Soviet spies. One man. In Tokyo, 10,000 kilometers from the front. This is not a metaphor. I'll tell you exactly how he did it. This story deserves an entire Netflix series. So, let's go. To understand how a German became Stalin's chief spy in Tokyo, befriending Hitler, we need to start in the trenches of World War I. Let's briefly transport ourselves to 1914. Without this, you won't understand his story. Richard Sorge is 18. He volunteers for the German army. A patriot, an idealist. He believes in Germany. But the Western Front quickly cures him of this belief, as it cures everyone. 3 wounds. The last one, shrapnel in both legs, shattered toes, a damaged spine. He limps for the rest of his life. In the hospital, a nurse, the daughter of a Russian émigré, slips him Marx. Not the Bible, not poetry. Karl Marx. And this is where something clicks. Sorge looks at his disfigured legs and asks himself the question millions have asked. For what? For the Kaiser? For industrialists? For a piece of land in Flanders? The answer he finds will define his entire life. Revolution. A global, communist revolution. And that's where the real excitement begins. By 1924, Sorge was a doctor of political science, a member of the Communist Party of Germany, and a Comintern functionary. He traveled across Europe, organizing cells, writing articles, and agitating workers. Moscow noticed him, not just because of his ideology, but also because of his skills. The man spoke German, because he was German. Russian was like a second native language, as his mother was Russian. English and French, fluently. He was intelligent, charming, daring. And, this is important, he knew how to make people like him. Sorge was liked because he was genuinely an interesting person. Cheerful, drinking, smoking, with good manners and bad habits. Someone you'd want to have a drink and a conversation with. An ideal agent. Not because he was inconspicuous, but because he was so noticeable that no one would suspect him. Moscow understood this and decided to use him. In 1929, Moscow recruited him for service. The 4th Directorate of the General Staff, military intelligence later known as the GRU. General Jan Berzin, the head of intelligence, a Latvian with a partisan background in the eyes of a man who had seen too much, personally instructed Sorge. The assignment? To become an illegal agent, to sever all visible ties with the communist movement, to leave, to become a German journalist, respectable, with good publications and the right connections, and to spy. Berzin warned him, if you fail, Moscow will not know you. You are on your own. Sorge agreed. Like everyone who agrees to such terms, he was confident there would be no failure, and of course, he was an ideological spy who believed he was serving a great common cause. Like everyone, he was mistaken. But there were still 12 years until that mistake. Now begins the story that still shocks all historians. His first assignment was Shanghai, 1930. Sorge arrived as a correspondent for German newspapers. A clever move. In Shanghai in 1930, every second person was an adventurer, every third a spy, and no one checked documents too carefully. It was a city where diplomats dined with smugglers, and intelligence agents from 3 countries sat in the same bar pretending not to recognize each other. Here, Sorge assembled his first spy network. It was also here, in a smoky bar, at a table with Japanese correspondents, that he met Hotsumi Ozaki, a quiet, thoughtful Japanese journalist, an intellectual, a secret communist, a man who hated Japanese militarism as much as Sorge hated German militarism. They found each other through shared convictions, and this proved stronger than any recruitment. Remember that name, Ozaki. 10 years later, he would become Sorge's most important source, and it would be through him that the thread would begin to unravel. And now, Tokyo. 1933. Hitler had just come to power in Berlin. Moscow sent Sorge to Japan with a specific mission, to infiltrate the German embassy in Tokyo and understand what Germany and Japan were planning together. Why? The USSR was a huge country bordering China and partially Japan. A double strike from the west and east simultaneously could be catastrophic. Information was needed. Sorge arrived as a respectable German journalist, a correspondent for the Frankfurter Zeitung, one of the most respected publications in Germany. But a mere journalistic credential wasn't enough for the embassy. He needed a recommendation. He needed trust. And Sorge made a move that professional intelligence officers still salute. He joined the NSDAP, a communist, with an NSDAP party card. In his pocket, a party badge with the German flag. In his head, Marx. If someone had written this in a novel, the editor would have crossed it out for implausibility. Wait, because what comes next is even crazier. Sorge didn't just infiltrate the embassy, he became one of their own. Ambassador Herbert von Dirksen and later his successor Eugen Ott both accepted Sorge as a friend. Ott, literally. And you know what they did? They drank together, dined together, discussed politics, strategy, Berlin's plans. One day, and this is documented, Ott called Sorge into his office and said, "Richard, I need your assessment. Berlin sent this." And he laid a secret telegram from Ribbentrop in front of him. Sorge read it, furrowed his brow, and provided an analysis. Intelligent, accurate, useful. OTT nodded, thanked him, and included Sorge's assessment in his report. And Sorge left, got in his car, drove home, and from memory, wrote down the contents of the telegram. Word for word. Ott never suspected. Ott was a smart man. Sorge simply didn't look or act like a spy. He looked like Richard, a cheerful, intelligent, drinking German journalist who knew Japan better than any diplomat. And every word Ott uttered at dinner would be on a desk in Moscow 3 hours later. Sorge would read secret telegrams from Berlin at breakfast, memorize them, and in the evening dictate them to his radio operator, Max Clausen. The radio operator would encrypt them, transmit them to Moscow. In the morning, Sorge would be back at the embassy, smiling, joking, pouring whiskey. Imagine, you're sitting at a table with the Reich's ambassador. He's telling you his government secrets, and 3 hours later you'll transmit every word to Stalin. And so it went for 8 years. 8 years of a life where every conversation was an operation, every joke a cover, every glass of whiskey a tool. And not a single slip-up. Not a single moment of panic. But Sorge wasn't just reading telegrams. He had burrowed into the very heart of the German machine. And this is what he found there. Here's where it gets properly insane. By 1938, Sorge was so integrated into the embassy that he was unofficially considered the ambassador's advisor on Japanese affairs. Ott consulted him before sending dispatches to Berlin. The military attaché showed him intelligence reports. Sorge helped draft diplomatic reports, and simultaneously copied them for Moscow. He was sitting inside the German intelligence machine, like a virus in an operating system. And the machine not only didn't notice him, it considered him part of itself. But information from the embassy was only half the picture. For the full picture, another source was needed. A Japanese one, to understand how Japan would act in case of war. Therefore, Sorge built an intelligence network. Hotsumi Ozaki, the same journalist from Shanghai, was now an advisor to Prime Minister Konoe's cabinet. Through Ozaki, Sorja gained access to top-level Japanese strategy. Branko Vukelic photographed documents. Yotoku Miyagi was the liaison. Max Clausen was the radio operator, the engine of the entire operation. 4 people, 1 center, Sorge. And in 1941, this machine went into full gear, because the information that flowed was worth millions of lives. 1941, January. And here begins the most important and most bitter part of this story. Sorge began transmitting signals. Germany was preparing to attack the Soviet Union. Specifics. Through Ott, he learned about the transfer of divisions to the east. Ozaki confirmed this from Japanese sources. Sorge sent radio message after radio message to Moscow. The first, in March. An attack was being prepared, tentatively for May to June. The second, in May. The dates were shifting, but the decision had been made. The third, on June 15th. The war would begin on June 22nd. 3 strikes. 170 divisions. The man in Tokyo, 10,000 kilometers from the border, transmitted the exact date, June 22nd, a week before the invasion. And Sorja wasn't the only one. Schulze-Boysen warned from Berlin. Military attachés reported from Bucharest, from Helsinki, from London. Churchill personally passed intelligence data to Stalin. Dozens of sources, dozens of warnings, dozens of specific dates. Stalin didn't believe a single one, because to believe meant to admit war was inevitable. And Stalin was convinced he could postpone it, that Hitler wouldn't attack until England was defeated, that all these radio messages were British provocations aimed at pitting Germany against the USSR. Logic? Yes. Correct? 27 million dead Russians say no. And now, the moment that makes Sorja's story not just tragic, but truly insane, and most importantly, incredibly salvific for the USSR. Stalin ignores the warning about Barbarossa, and 4 months later, the Germans are at the gates of Moscow. Catastrophe. The Red Army retreats, losing millions. The Germans are pushing towards Moscow. And in October 1941, a new question arises. What will Japan do? If Japan strikes from the east, Siberia, the Far East, the Soviet Union will be encircled. A double blow. On the western front, the Wehrmacht. On the eastern front, the Kwantung Army. This is the end. And it is here that Sorge does what saves Moscow. A specific battle. A specific turning point in the war. September to October 1941. Ozaki learns through his government contacts. Japan has made a decision. Not north, south. A strike against Southeast Asia, against British and Dutch colonies. For oil. Not against the Soviet Union. Sorja transmits this to Moscow on September 14th. The Japanese government has decided not to attack the USSR this year. The threat from the east is removed until spring. And here, pay attention, Stalin believes. The same agent he called a scoundrel 3 months ago. The same radio messages. The same source. Why? Because now, believing is profitable. Because if Japan doesn't attack, Stalin can transfer the Siberian divisions west to Moscow, which the Germans might capture. Fresh, well-equipped, trained for winter warfare. 18 divisions, 200,000 men, 1,700 tanks, 1,500 aircraft. An army capable of turning the tide of the war. Only one thing remained, to believe the man who, 3 months ago, was called a scoundrel. Let that sink in. One warning, he didn't believe. Another, he did. The difference wasn't in the quality of the intelligence, not in the reliability of the source. The difference was in convenience. The first warning required actions Stalin didn't want to take. Mobilization, deployment, acknowledging the threat. The second required actions he desperately wanted to take. Troop redeployment, saving Moscow. The same agent, the same radio station, the same credibility. 2 opposite decisions. Remember this, because this paradox will later kill the man who created it. The Siberian divisions arrived near Moscow in late November to early December, And this is what it looked like for the Germans. Minus 30 degrees. The Wehrmacht, exhausted in summer uniforms with frozen equipment, stood in the suburbs of Moscow. Tanks wouldn't start, rifles jammed, soldiers lit bonfires to keep from freezing, thereby giving away their positions. And then, from the snow, appeared men in white sheepskin coats. Fresh, equipped, with automatic weapons that fired in any frost. 18 divisions. 200,000 men who weren't there yesterday. German intelligence was in a panic. Where from? The answer: from Siberia. From the border that Stalin risked exposing. Because one man in Tokyo told him that Japan would not attack. On December 5th, the counteroffensive began. The Wehrmacht was pushed back 100 to 250 kilometers, Germany's first major defeat in World War II. The Blitzkrieg was stopped. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was shattered. And at the foundation of this counteroffensive were 18 divisions that Stalin risked withdrawing from the eastern border, because he believed Sorge, partially, exactly the half that was convenient for him. But by this point, Sorge was already dead. Well, almost. October 18th, 1941. Japanese counterintelligence, Toko, arrested him. Through a chain. A small, dull, mundane chain. It didn't start with Sorge. It started with Yotoku Miyagi, the liaison, an artist. Miyagi was the weak link. He was sick with tuberculosis. He was tired. He drank. And one day, he said too much to someone. Toko apprehended Miyagi. Miyagi tried to commit suicide. He jumped out a window. He survived. And he gave testimony. He named Ozaki Toko. Apprehended Ozaki. Ozaki was a strong man, but after several days of interrogation, he realized that denying was futile. He confirmed the existence of the network. And he named Sorge. The morning of October 18th. Sorge opened the door to his apartment in Tokyo. On the threshold were Toko officers. He said, "Come in," calmly, as if he had been expecting them, because perhaps he had. He knew Miyagi had been arrested. He knew Ozaki had been arrested. He knew his time was up. Could he have fled? Theoretically, yes. But where? To the German embassy? He was a Soviet spy. To the Soviet embassy? He didn't exist in Tokyo. To a ship? The ports were blocked. Sorge stayed, like a man who knows the chess game is lost but wants to play it to the end. And now, prison. And here begins the part that is spoken of the least, because it is not cinematic. It is quiet. Interrogations lasted for months. Japanese investigators were the complete opposite of the Gestapo. They talked. For hours. For days. They brought tea. They asked questions softly, patiently, like professors during an exam. And Sorge, surprisingly, began to talk. Not because he broke, but because he decided that telling his story was more important than remaining silent. He meticulously described his work, his methods, his sources. He admitted to espionage, but presented it as an ideological mission. "I didn't work against Japan. I worked for peace." The investigator asked, "Did you understand that you were breaking the law?" Sorge replied, "I understood that I was fulfilling a duty that was above any law." Thousands of pages of Sorge's interrogation transcripts are still kept in archives. Investigator Yoshikawa would later say that Sorge was the smartest man he had ever interrogated, and the calmest, as if he wasn't interrogating a defendant but a conversationalist who simply wanted to finally tell who he really was. But Sorge wasn't alone in that cell. Next door, through the wall, sat the man with whom it all began. And what about Ozaki? Hotsumi Ozaki, that quiet Japanese intellectual, Sorge's friend since their Shanghai days, behaved differently during interrogations, directly, without excuses. He said, "I knew what I was doing. I believed Japan was heading for disaster, and I tried to prevent that disaster. I have no regrets." Before his execution, Ozaki wrote a letter to his wife. He explained everything. And the last line, "Take care of Yoko," their daughter, who was 7 years old. Ozaki was hanged on the same day as Sorge, November the 7th. Two men who met in a Shanghai bar 14 years earlier died in the same prison hours apart. The trial. The verdict. Death by hanging. Osaki. Also death. Miyagi died in prison from tuberculosis before his trial. Clausen and Vukolich received life sentences. And here begins the most disgusting part. Moscow was silent. Silence. Yet an exchange was possible. Japan twice, through neutral channels, offered Moscow to take Sorja, to exchange him for Japanese prisoners. Moscow refused. Both times. The wording, icy. We do not know a man named Richard Sorge. They knew him. They received his radio messages. They used his data to transfer divisions. And they replied, unknown. Sorge sat on death row in Sugamo prison and waited. 1,052 days. Almost 3 years. Every day. Possibly his last. He read. He wrote. He waited. No one came for him. No one offered an exchange. His own country, the country he worked for which he risked his life for 8 years, pretended he didn't exist. Imagine. You gave 8 years of your life. Every evening at the German embassy bar, a game with death. Every radio message, a potential gallows. And when the gallows come, your side silently turns away. Because to acknowledge Sorja means to admit that Stalin received accurate data and threw it in the trash. And Stalin cannot be wrong. Therefore, the man who saved Moscow officially never existed. November 7th, 1944, Revolution Day, celebrations in Moscow, parades, speeches, and in Tokyo, in Sugamo prison, Richard Sorge was led down the corridor. A rope, a stool. He refused a blindfold. His last words, according to various sources, were either Red Army or Soviet Union, or simply silence. He was 49 years old. His body was buried in the prison cemetery. No name on the grave, no flowers, no delegation. And now, a detail that is truly unsettling. Hanako Ishii, a Japanese woman, Sorja's former lover. They had been together for several years before his arrest. After his execution, she went to the prison, asked for the body. They refused her. She returned, again and again. For months. Finally, she was allowed to take the remains. She reburied him in Tama Cemetery in Tokyo. She placed a headstone. With her own money. A humble Japanese woman. The only person on the planet who remembered where the most valuable spy of World War II lay. The Soviet Union? Silent. Germany? He was a traitor. Japan? He was a criminal. And Hanako Ishii brought flowers. Every year. For the rest of her life. 1964. 20 years after the execution. Khrushchev. The Thaw. And suddenly, the Soviet Union remembered Sorja. Richard Sorge was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. A postage stamp. A street in Moscow. Films. Books. A legend. The very country that for 20 years pretended he didn't exist, now called him a hero. Why? Because Stalin was dead. Because now it was possible to say, Stalin made a mistake, ignored the warnings, but Sorga, he's a hero. Sorge became an instrument of de-Stalinization. In life, an instrument of intelligence. After death, an instrument of politics. Unneeded alive. Useful dead. And Hanako Ishii, in 1961, 3 years before the Soviet award, published memoirs about Sorge in Japan. She was the first to tell his story to the world. The Japanese woman who loved to spy. She lived until 2000. 86 years old. And until her last years, she brought flowers to Tama Cemetery, to the grave of the man thanks to whom the USSR defeated Germany outside Moscow, and who was betrayed by everyone but her. Richard Sorge was born on October 4th, 1895, in Baku. German by father, Russian by mother. Hanged on November 7th, 1944, in Tokyo. His intelligence on Barbarossa, one of the most accurate in history. His intelligence on Japan turned the tide of the war. One was ignored, the other was used. The same man, the same truth. Two opposite reactions. Look at any system that receives inconvenient information. The reaction is always the same. Convenient truth. Accepted. Inconvenient truth. Destroyed along with the one who brought it. In Tama Cemetery in Tokyo, there stands a headstone. Simple. Gray. With a name that was not spoken aloud for 20 years. Next to it, fresh flowers. No one has been there to bring them for 26 years. But they still appear.